Thank you so much, Sanjoy, and pleasure to be amongst everyone. A quick 30-second plug. IndiaSpend, we started using data to tell stories almost 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago. And we still feel that after all these years, even as we see quite gratefully the cohort of journalists who look at data expand quite encouragingly, we still see the journey ahead being a long one, including for all the reasons that Sanjoy pointed out. So thank you very much for having me over. This is to the Newslaundry team and teamwork. So what I'm going to do is we've got 4 speakers who've been very briefly introduced to you. So they're going to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes each on the topic from their vantage point. I've also urged them to use some examples and case studies so that it becomes more accessible to you in the manner of how data can really use to tell stories, or for that matter, achieve impact, whether temporary or long lasting. And after which we go into a conversation. You're of course invited to leave your questions and or question some of the statements that have been made, and we'll hopefully bring that into the conversation as well. So on that note, let me hand over to Dr. Anisha Sharma for her comments.
Anisha, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks very much, Govind, and Newslaundry for inviting me here. I want to start by talking just a little bit about communication of particularly of nuanced insights using data, and from the perspective of an academic. I'm a professional economist, and as a profession, I think economists in particular have been caught in a credibility crisis for the past decade or so. As a community, we have failed to communicate insights on which we actually have quite a settled consensus. So whether it's the economic benefits of immigration or the costs of fiscal austerity, or to borrow an example a little closer to home, the adverse effects of the demonetization intervention. Now, this is quite ironic because similar to other quantitative social scientists, we are used to working with large and often complex data sets. And all of our research is driven by our ability to make credible causal claims. And so it's quite ironic that we are caught in this credibility trap where people, the white, a lot of the insights that we have to offer. I think there's some reasons for this. One is that data is quite hard or tedious to get access to. So even data that's supposed publicly available can be quite hard to get hold of. And so people find it hard to verify some of the things that we say. Even when it's available, there's just a lot of detail that can be quite hard to process and to communicate. Just recently, a few weeks ago, we had this social media meltdown for a couple of days over GDP numbers that had just come out. And so we had this long back and forth, not over sophisticated arguments relating to how we measure GDP or how we quantify economic activity, but over comparatively simple issues such as how do you compare quarterly data to annual data? Or how do you compare GDP numbers generated from one country with GDP numbers from another country? And I think we got in this situation where even journalists were having to delete and update their graphics showing which country had been affected most adversely by coronavirus pandemic multiple times in the course of a single day. Now, this data is publicly available, so you could log on to the RBI website, but it's quite tedious to do. Once you get there, you have all these kind of large, intimidating tables. You have lots of explanatory notes and qualifications and caveats and so on. And so I think what ends up happening in practice is a lot of complex data that has to be processed and communicated in a fairly straight way, which turns out to be really difficult to do. So I want to talk a little bit about an initiative that we are starting at Ashoka University. We're setting up a Center for Economic Data and Analysis, so CEDA, CEDA. Where we plan to host a number of large, usually just publicly available data sets that provide easily downloadable and visualizable insights to people. Now, this is somewhat in common with a large number of data portals that already exist, but there's some very specific tools that we think are currently missing and that we want to add. One of them is that we want people to be able to correlate simple variables with one another. So for example, can we correlate migration with economic activity? This is important because this is going to be the basis for a large number of stories and narratives that people write about and talk about. In addition to that, we also want to be able to publish a large number of data stories. And we would really love to do this in collaboration with journalists, with policymakers, with the people in the wider public, non-academic researchers, and so on. And here, I think there's a huge space as well. There's so many issues over which people have prior beliefs, which are quite honestly very wrong or incorrect. Right? People don't have a sense of what economic gaps between different caste groups are. People don't even have a clear sense of what demographic distributions are across different states in India. And I think it would be great if some of these stories could be made more easily available to people using insights from data through visualizations, particularly, that are easily available. And finally, we want to be able to allow people to understand comparative economic development across different states of India. And in this regard, we're quite inspired by one example in particular, and that's Our World in Data, which I'm sure many of you will have become familiar with over the last few months because of their excellent coronavirus data tracker. Our World in Data was set up a few years ago now at Oxford University. And it was really imagined as a tool to allow people to understand the processes of comparative economic development, understand why some countries were able to press so in such a short span of time in the last few decades in terms of improving living standards and why some others weren't. And we want to be able to do that within India at the level of the states. And so those are some of the ideas that we're working with. We'd be really happy to hear from journalists in particular, what are the kinds of constraints they face, and how we can work together in order to improve communication relating to data to the wider public.
Okay, thanks, Anisha. I think that's a very, very good note to end on. I mean, the power of collaboration is not just important, but also critical when it comes to data and data journalism. And not just in India, I mean, elsewhere in the world, data journalists usually come together, work cross-functional, including with universities and people like you to really get the best out. Because journalists don't always have the best analytical capability when it comes to numbers. And but in partnering with someone like you, you can really have something powerful. Okay, over to you, Ashwini.
Thank you, Govind, and thank you, Anisha. That's a fantastic initiative and quite well aligned with and facilitate the general tendency that I see, very heartening, of journalists looking for data. And I mean, that is the first step. I have been involved in setting up the India Data Portal with very similar ambition as what you just described. The idea of the India Data Portal that has now been functional for a year is to make data available in usable format. There's a lot of useful data, but like Anisha pointed out, you have to know that it is on the RBI data site. Which part of the RBI data site can you find it, which is the database on the Indian economy? It's not obvious. And then you can download it in terms of an Excel file that is macro-enabled and formatted. It's not amenable to use at all by someone who is not trained in data science. So the idea is to make useful data usable and available on the India Data Portal so that journalists can interact with it, visualize it, download the visualization with minor edits in terms of title, change the axis, etc., to be able to put it directly into their stories so that it can go into the newsrooms straight away. And to do it in vernacular languages. Now, one of the challenges and problems that the India Data Portal seeks to address is the increasing concentration in Indian print media in particular, where a few newspapers have very sophisticated and advanced data centers. So the Hindu Business Line and the Times of India and Economic Times have top of the line New York Times quality graphics, but the newsrooms of vernacular newspapers do not have the resources, and the editors do not have the time, and the journalists are stringers and not even full-time employment. These are the people that we want to reach so that they don't have to spend that extra time that they don't have in interacting with the data, that at least for those who know that it will be useful for their own stories and will provide more nuance to their arguments. It's already operational in multiple languages, and we continue to add both data sets and languages, and we will continue to do so over the next few months. I want to take another minute to point to a new dimension to the India Data Portal, which is high frequency high resolution near real-time data, especially to monitor economic recovery. And there is a tab that is now operational on the India Data Portal, where we have data sets with daily frequency and monthly frequency available in near real time. Some of these daily data sets are available within 2 or 3 days of the date for which the data is available. And some of this has been made possible by the Government of India making data, especially transaction data, publicly available immediately. So fertilizer sales, for example, have moved almost entirely to sales through the point of sale devices, which are digital, and therefore the transaction is recorded on a server immediately. And this data is made available on the Department of Fertilizer's website, and we take that. Similarly, 90% of transactions in agricultural markets, the mandis, are again electronic transactions that are recorded, and the AgMarkNet data website makes that available with a 2 or 3 day lag max, and so on. All of these data sources make it possible for us to get a synaptic view of the pattern and process of economic recovery at a fairly high resolution, because these are data sets that are available at the level of the point of sale device and the level of the agricultural market by commodity at a daily level. I hope that all of this together, and not just the India Data Portal, but many other initiatives, will come together to make data usable. There is a lot of useful data, and a lot of that data is now made available in the public domain, but it is not really usable. And the more such efforts we can, of course, we will need to coordinate and do a better job to provide a product that is actually useful. But to make data usable, I believe, is the next step that we need to work with in order to improve the quality of journalism. So I'll stop there, and of course, I look forward to other comments. Thank you, Govind.
Thank you very much, Ashwini. So I just noticed that you talked about, and it sounds interesting about the more real time it gets. And I know that as data gets more real time, it becomes more exciting for people to consume it. So, but I do mention, I mean, I do notice that you talk about recovery. So is there any growth in the horizon, or?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Rukmini, over to you.
So it's very exciting for me to hear about all of these initiatives, the Ashoka initiative, the India Data Portal, and what people like How India Lives are already doing. Because I've been doing this from 2010 with a couple of breaks in between, and I feel like if I was to, assign function to all of the hours I've spent in it, I feel like 5 of those 10 years have been putting data in usable formats. Now, and this seems like something that would cut a lot of that time. Part of this is, personal feeling. So, for example, I come into this without a background in statistics or tech, which is not something that I would recommend to any data journalist now. All of which would have set up a lot of the manual donkey work that I felt that I feel like I've done for a long time. But one of the things that I found, and maybe you might see this as well, is that I don't feel like we're making the case for data journalism anymore. I feel like that case has been made. That maybe was something I felt like I was doing in the first couple of years, where I had to make the case maybe to editors. Editors would have to make the case. Even the way we were writing articles was in a slightly needy way, trying to tell people why they needed to see these numbers, why the numbers really did tell a story beyond what, say, the Vox Pop style of journalism was telling. And the other thing that I don't feel that I need to make a case for anymore is that the people I'm talking to do understand that data journalists exist. So, for example, in 2013, a story that I worked on for almost 6 months, partly because I didn't have the sort of usable format data that people like Anisha and Ashwini are talking about, was a story around sexual assault trials in Delhi's district courts. And I literally had to keep that tab open and sort of chip away at it for 6 months. Every few months, their capture system would change, anything again. But sometimes they had a word search, then that disappeared. So, but when I finally got it together, some of the insights from it, I wanted to put those questions back to judges or to cops. what I was finding is that there was a lot of consenting inter-caste or intermarriage, inter-religious couples on whom the male partner rape charges were being foisted by usually the girl's parents. And that was a big proportion of the total cases, and it sort of gave us an insight into understanding what these large Delhi sexual assault numbers could also mean. But one of the things I found is when I put these numbers back to judges and cops, is they would say, but we've not put this out, we've not said this. The idea of other people looking at your information to come back to you with insights was still a case that I had to make then. And that's, very much less now. I don't feel like people do a double take when I tell them what my job is either. They get it. And of course, more so now during the pandemic. And the other thing is that I think I used to feel more of a pushback from readers as well about people being reduced to numbers. So, for example, any analysis that involved caste, especially when it came to unexpected areas, like we did an analysis of the names that movie stars characters were taking in Hindi films and the caste that those belonged to, and how they were overwhelmingly upper caste Hindu names. And there was a lot of pushback from readers, not just because of upper caste pushback against such an analysis, but also because of feeling that, well, this doesn't tell you anything, you just reduced it to numbers, you're just looking at categories. That's another thing that I don't feel like I'm needing to make the case anymore. People do understand the insights that come from this sort of cold number analysis as well. I think the change really, I felt it around the 2014 elections, when in particular there was a desire for the Gujarat model to be better analyzed through numbers. We did do that, and what came of it is something I'll talk about just in a minute. But in terms of feeling the tide change, I felt that around the 2014 election, that I was not making a case for data journalism anymore. There's a couple of additional issues that I feel that we could expand data journalism to now. One is what Ashwini mentioned, which is very important. There is a lot of hunger among non-English media for data stories. And I, very honestly will say that I feel very bad having to say so much, because the way the economics of non-English media works is they simply do not pay very well. So, making data more accessible and usable for journalists employed by non-English media to use it themselves to tell stories seems like a great direction that we could expand data journalism to. The other thing is that I think, and this is really the role that remains for journalists, even if data becomes fully open to everyone, this remains a role for journalists, into interrogating how the sausage is made, right? That's still a very key part of understanding data. So, for example, what Somesh Jha Business Standard has done, for example, reporting on the sort of machinations behind employment numbers, behind household consumption numbers. And I felt like that was one thing that was very satisfying for me to do as well, which is something I did with the NCRB, the Crime Bureau numbers. One of the things that I found in talking to someone is that we were following a principal offense rule, which is that if an FIR had involved two or more crimes, only the crimes that carried the highest punishment was included in the NCRB statistics, which was not mentioned in the disclaimers, limitations at the time. And so, the push for it really came when the 2012 Delhi bus rape would have been in those statistics as a murder and not a rape, because that was what carried a higher sentence. Again, writing about that at that time meant quite a bit of pushback from the police, but subsequently they have changed it and they include it in the disclaimers. So that's an important rule for journalists, I think. About what I think the challenges now for data journalism are, they're twofold and sort of interconnected for me, and in a way they recall this Gujarat model 2014 reporting. One is gaining people's trust and having to convince them of your credibility is a real challenge, and I don't think it is to be shrugged off or taken lightly, and we really need to think through. Maybe we can do more of what about making sources more. People who want to can go and look at the data themselves and see if we're saying the right thing. Additionally, I just feel like it worries me that that my own confidence or any data journalist's confidence that they are changing minds through their stories. I don't have that. I don't have a great confidence in that. So I know when I write something, sometimes my parents will feel, oh, this is it. My WhatsApp group was saying all of this and it's all misinformation, but now I'm going to share your story and I'm sure this will, I'm not sure it works. I'm not sure that, I feel like these bubbles have become very hard and very difficult to permeate. So thinking about how to break through them is really the big challenge for me now. So just for an example, if we talk about the pandemic right now in India, there are very clearly two sets of people who make two arguments. One looks at the per capita information and wants to make the point that India is doing much better than everyone else. One is looking at absolutes and wants to make the point that India is doing much worse than anyone else. Obviously, the truth lies in the middle, but I don't think enough people are doing a good job of walking that. And each side mocking or ignoring the other is just doing a big disservice to our overall understanding of things. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rukmini. And I think it was a good to end on the COVID note about which is the number. So what's your, I mean, what do other countries pick, or what have they picked in your understanding?
I think it's less of a problem for most countries because of the per capita question is much bigger for us. But then I've seen in that famous clip of Trump talking to Jonathan Swan of Axios, essentially what they were talking about was this. Right? It was per capita. That was where the argument lay. So in different forms, other people are having this argument too.
Right. Mihir, over to you.
Right. So thanks, Govind, and thank you all of you for. I wanted to go last because I wanted to sort of hear everybody, and I think we've got a wonderful set of perspectives here. I was particularly interested by Rukmini saying that she doesn't need to explain what she does anymore; that people get it, and that's on one level that's very cheering. I think the issue is, however, that there is still a lot of resistance to the idea of a data story, of a story expressed through data, partly because of the reason that Rukmini said, that you're reducing something to numbers. But I also think that there is this very special kind of mistrust that is attached to when people present you with a data story. It's like, you've come to me with numbers. They look at this thing and then they sort of, go give it the side eye and say, you've come to me with numbers. All right. I don't really look at numbers all the time. If you've come to me with numbers, that means you're trying to con me in some way. All right. And this is part of the psychology of how people respond to data journalism is this, right? That they know that they aren't thinking in terms of those particular numbers all the time. They may not have been following them in the past. And therefore, when it is presented to them one day, they're not completely certain, especially if it challenges their preconceived notions about whatever the subject is. And I think that, so therefore, part of what has to be done when you're telling a story like this is you have to explain why it's better than a regular argument, why it's better than an example. You have to go on doing it time after time, and it's a little difficult, but at least I seem to have to keep on doing it. And of course, the importance of data is not that that it always tells the truth in some sense, but that it's probably a little easier to detect evasions if people are using it, right? And so if somebody is trying to lie with data, they leave tracks in it. If somebody is trying to mislead you with a publicly available data set, you can probably, with a bit of work, track down how they are misleading you, etc., etc., etc. And I think that takes me to the second thing that I want to do, which is that part of the success of the past 7-10 years of data stories coming out, it has sort of led to a problem. And the problem is that people now, when faced with the fact that data from under their control is contradicting what they want to say, are trying to cut down on some kinds of data that they put out. right? So there are changes to how, there was a time when 10 years ago, you could by and large go and tell people, look, I want this data, and then they would complain in a procedural kind of way. Like, we have so far been presenting it in cyclostyle sheets with 4 copies. Isn't that enough? Why do you need it on a CD, right? And so that was the case that you had to make. Now it's a more genuine suspicion. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with this? Is it going to make me look bad? Is it going to make my boss look bad? Is it going to make my government look bad? Is it going to make my social media team look bad? Right. So there is that immediate set of questions which they are asking now, which they may not have asked that effectively about 6 or 7 years ago. And they've come up with, people have come up with some very clever ways to get around this, right? So one way is you get your story in first with a graph. And I think that is with ideally a misleading graph. Okay, so that is the what happened with the the big GDP kerfuffle, the quarterly GDP kerfuffle that Anisha was talking about a little earlier, which is essentially that once you get 15,000 graphs out very, very quickly that claim to interpret data, but that has just become publicly available, but aren't really that accurate, or in this case, outright inaccurate / misleading, you've already won the news battle for that, the data news battle for that day. And the rest of us could, very painstakingly point out, no, actually, annualized means this, quarterly means this, blah, 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 try and explain what it means. But that's a news cycle later. And for people who want to win a news cycle, you've already lost. Right. So from that point of view, that's one way in which they're fighting a battle against responsible data journalism. The other one is essentially to make data less comparable over time. All right. And so what you do is you do a variation of what Rukmini was talking about, except you're doing it deliberately. All right. So you will suddenly start reporting, your definitions will change between data sets. And suddenly you can say, okay, you seem to be doing really well in 2015 on road building, as composed to in 2013. Is that a genuine achievement, or have you changed how you're reporting the data? Have you changed your definition of a road? Have you changed your definition of highway building? And it turns out that maybe you have. All right, and in the case of highway building, for example, yes, there was a major definitional change that meant that numbers aren't strictly comparable across years. And at, of course, the highest possible level, this takes us to the whole question of comparing GDP across time. All right, so GDP growth in the era after you've taken what is called the new GDP series, and GDP growth in the using an earlier methodology are very difficult to compare. And people have sort of gotten used to this. Now, after there was a big noise about it a few years ago, people have gotten used to it. But the effect essentially is that now you can't really talk about comparable GDP anymore. Nobody takes it seriously. All right. So the government and people who control data, I shouldn't just mean the government, because in journalism, a lot of this comes from companies. All right. I mean, I've worked for a financial newspaper in the past, and a lot of that, a lot of this manipulation of work it comes from the corporate world. But the idea essentially is that the people who do control data have a large number of things at their disposal, even if they are being supposedly transparent, in order to fight back against what data journalists are doing. And we're just beginning to see the initial salvos of what I suspect will be a fairly long battle. Thank you, Govind.
Thanks, Mihir. You also raised some very, very pertinent issues. So let me ask you a broad question, and I want to come to you and Ashwini for this. So Ashwini took a view that there is a lot of, let's say, interesting real-time data streaming. I think he talked about fertilizer sales. He also talked about mandis and the data. I mean, transactional data from mandis. So now that's one set of data which you can do things with. Maybe you can extrapolate upwards or sideways, and then you have, let's say, the kind of questions you're raising about maybe the bigger numbers, right? So the GDP issue that you refer to. Rukmini also talked about the issues to do with the consumption, household consumption, and save and employment data, where things were going back and forth. So where is it? I mean, so if you were to take a step back now, is the noise overwhelming the signal, or can we still make sense from these other smaller streams of data? I don't know if small streams is the right word, but let's say, maybe that's, I'm just using that to explain something.
I get that. Yeah. I think that, Govind, part of what we're going to have to do is what China watchers have done for a very long time, right? Which is to go out and try and find data streams that are fairly high frequency, high quality, and not compromised or very difficult to control on a daily basis. And from that, we'll have to develop our own aggregation systems. And the problem with this is that the China economy, a lot of the best ones became proprietary, right? And so, there'd be particular agencies or particular people who follow that economy who understood it better because they put in more work at finding these particular data streams and aggregating them, etc. And we have to try and ensure that at least for publicly, for things for questions that are important to the public discourse, all right, that doesn't take over our economy as well. And I think that, one of the great advantages of the past 7 or 8 years of sort of tech fixation solely taking over the government, there have been many disadvantages, but one of the advantages is that everybody's heard the word dashboard, and they've been told that the word dashboard is an excellent thing. All right. So now dashboards may or may not really work in terms of monitoring capability, but what they do mean is that people say, I want that data out this thing and sabko dikha do. All right, send it out to the public as far as possible. I'd be very interested to see if that instinct survives the next 6 months to a year. If that high frequency data is not always supporting what people are already saying in public, right? So if 2 months from now a chief minister or a prime minister or a finance minister stands up and says the recovery is on, and some unfortunate person on social media goes to Ashwini's website and says, well, actually, all right, according to these 7 high quality data streams, the recovery is not on. The first question that minister is going to ask is, where is this data coming from? Who let this data out? Why don't I know, etc., etc. So now, if it survives that process, then let's see.
Right.
Warning, okay. Ashwini, that's all I'm saying.
Got it. So I'd really like everyone to weigh in on this because I'm guessing that this is a moot point. Ashwini, go ahead.
I think I would like to distinguish between 3 different sets of questions. One is what Rukmini posed, and what is fundamental to journalism is to investigate the nature of the sausage, right? So no amount of, I would choose the word narrow data streams, not smaller. So they are narrow they just tell you about fertilizer sales, right? Nothing else. GDP is just too broad, may not tell you as much as sales of fertilizer. It's very narrow and specific and so on. What a journalist needs is a good understanding of the agricultural economy and the sector and the interconnections and the process and the dynamics to make sense of the 3 data streams on fertilizers, on markets, and on subsidies, agricultural subsidies. That cannot be taken away just by adding data to the mix. So it's not that data scientists should become journalists. It's that journalists should integrate these new data streams, these narrow data streams that are available. The second is about data integrity and speaks to Mihir's question, which is whether data will continue to be made available after journalists use it to argue against the party position or the official government position. And again, that comes back to our role as civil society and not just journalists to make sure that we call out when that happens. And it's difficult, at least in a democracy, to go back once you make data available online. It's possible to keep on fudging data that has never been transparent. So you can play around with GDP a lot, but it's very hard to play around with fertilizer sales data. So just right. The third and final part of it is, one is the data story of the day. Extreme. The The second other extreme that I want to focus on, again, that Rukmini pointed out, is the vernacular journalist is not getting into that what is the data story of the day, and they are never going to win that battle. But if they can put one additional graphics on what is the proportion of Dalits in this district where he is providing the voice of the people on atrocities on Dalits, that is a victory for me. And that itself holds value if a large number of vernacular journalists start doing that.
Got it. I must share, when we launched a quality network driven by a low-cost sensor monitoring network, and which in turn was feeding real-time data on a dashboard over the cloud, which you could see. And for the first time in Delhi, it became clear that, how pollution levels are moving, because there was no other data point that was easily, or data source that was easily accessible. But I mean, that apart, the pushback that we got at that point, including saying that, listen, this is a $25 or $30 sensing device. What we are using is a $15,000 device. I mean, not even willing to listen to that. We've put in a lot of effort on the back end on calibrating the data to ensure that at least the headline data was accurate. So, I mean, the pushback is something that I'm familiar with, but I think the whole point about narrow data streams versus broad data streams, if I can now define it, that is very interesting. Anisha, do you want to respond on that, and then Rukmini after that?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on actually what Mihir was saying about pushback. I think this is a real concern, but I think the nature of the pushback is also going to be a little nuanced. The current government is quite invested in making data publicly available, or certain kinds of data publicly available, through exactly the kinds of portals and platforms that we've been discussing. So Niti Aayog is launching with great fanfare this National Data Analytics Portal, which is supposed to make all administrative data easily available to people in a very usable format. Rolling that kind of thing back is going to be difficult. So I think I certainly agree politicians will always have incentives to mislead on this front, but they're going to have to find different ways of doing it. I think the investment in making data available to the wider public, that has been made now, thanks to a lot of the work that's been done in the last 10 years by journalists and researchers and so on. So I think being able to tackle that will mean getting into where the data is coming from, when it's being made available, and so on. But I doubt, for example, that the end app is now going to vanish overnight.
Yeah, and I also remember that AAP government in Delhi, after pushing back at that time, also announced that it would set up a 150 monitoring station network, for which I don't remember very clearly, but I think even tenders were issued. But that monitoring network has obviously still to come. Rukmini?
I think I'm most invested in still keeping these broad data sources publicly available, partly because there is a privilege and access to the narrower sources, and I don't want us to allow this shrinking of our democratic spaces, which if we stop pushing back against, I mean, I know no one here is suggesting that we stop pushing back, but that remains the biggest area of my focus. So for example, in the early months just post lockdown or during the lockdown, there was a very clear sense that access to routine healthcare services was severely curtailed, but there wasn't any data available yet. So one of the sort of workarounds that some people tried, and I want to, this is the thing with many of the narrow streams, alternative streams, they're out there because someone wants them to be out there as well. So this only data source that was available was Ayushman Bharat utilization. And as it turned out, that painted a very problematic picture, and I do believe it was used. It was quite convenient propaganda for the government ultimately, because what that ended up showing was that utilization in surgeries under Ayushman Bharat crashed, and the argument made when the data was put out was to say that this means that people aren't dying, in large numbers of other things. People aren't getting sick of undiagnosed COVID because nobody's really going to the hospital. What the broad stream here was the National Health Mission, which I was able to write about for IndiaSpend, which showed that because that was not only Ayushman Bharat level surgeries, that was everything from immunizations up to cancer treatment, all of it had crashed all over the country. So it was clearly an access issue and not a lack of illness issue. Similarly, there's other alternative streams that, I mean, I think they still need to be debated more before we accept that as a result of it. So once again, one of the things that's happening in all states, which again I wrote about for IndiaSpend, is that they've set up these death audit committees, which are supposed to go through all the COVID deaths and then decide which of them should be accepted or not, in clear violation of WHO and ICMR norms, which say that all of them should be accepted as COVID deaths right now. I've not been able to get them under RTI yet. And that's actually a two-level problem. One is that we haven't got them under RTI. The second is that they need to be got under RTI. So if I focus my energies on sort of the bottom of the ladder, I'll forget to focus my energies on the top, which is that this shouldn't be under RTI. This is your obligation to put these numbers out. There should be nothing secretive about them, and journalists shouldn't be digging them out in every state. And on economic activity, one example is that I've seen a lot of, Anisha and Mihir will know this much better than me. I don't know how useful this is, but I've seen a lot of recent papers that use night lights as a proxy for economic activity. And it always reminds me of every Diwali there'll be a viral WhatsApp photo that says, "Oh, this is how India looks from NASA," which is always completely fake. But the minute I see that night lights information, I'm just like, are we sure this is a good idea, or are we getting into Diwali NASA territory?
Right. Okay. So, Mihir, let me come back to you. So, the dashboard approach. I mean, Anisha says that, once you set up a dashboard, like, for instance, the number of LED bulbs that have been given out, and that was a very impressive looking dashboard, which, of course, maybe was time bound in a way, but there are many other dashboards, including the one Rukmini just referred to on health. So, once these dashboards come out, is there no going back, or is there always that prospect of things turning around?
No, I think Anisha is right that the dashboard will continue to exist, the program will continue to exist, but I think that people will suddenly discover that the data may be slower to update. All right, and so if you go back to some of the dashboards that were released with some fanfare about 4 years ago, you'll discover that some of them have gotten a little stuck in time. So the data will be slow to update. Definitely, the other clever thing that you could do is that I could say, I am going to improve my dashboard and improve my data. And everyone will say, Talia, claps, he is improving his dashboard. And then you make it incomparable with past data. All right. So immediately, that's how you sell that change, that this is yeah. And the point about incomparable, Govind, is that is essentially how you deal with accountability, especially when people are trying to say that I have done this much work over the past year or 2 years. You have to say, was that better than normal or worse than normal? And that simple question has become quite difficult to answer.
Right. So let me put the same question a little differently, and others are welcome to jump in as well. Anisha, let me come to you. Every program, if you look at flagship programs as they were called in the previous government, and many other programs that are on, usually have a part of their budget put aside, even up to 10% from my understanding, for monitoring and reporting of data. So is that something that's a way to actually ensure, and maybe in a way kind of it ensures that data does come through, and which in turn allows us to do the right kind of proxifying or whatever like others are doing?
Yeah, there's just a ton of administrative data out there, and it's only really now that that governments are realizing they need to make this available more publicly. But this, of course, goes back to Ashwini's point of not all of this is always very usable. A lot of the data, especially at the district level or at a much more granular level, is going to be very hard to integrate and combine with other data sets. Even if you look at projects that are done by major donors like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the World Bank or whoever it is, their data or their monitoring data will also sit in silos. And so merging that across and combining it with broader socioeconomic data that we already have, that also becomes really challenging. So, monitoring data, program data, all of that is great, subject to whatever caveats we have about measurement. But actually putting that in context with other variables that allow you to tell a coherent story, that becomes really difficult to do. So where it's done, I think, we need to have more of these initiatives to make these efforts to synchronize as public goods. So it becomes available to people and doesn't just sit in the silo of one organization or one bottle or whatever it is.
Okay, Ashwini?
I think my major takeaway from this is the extent to which it makes possible for journalists to raise questions of accountability. Mihir already alluded to it. I think I would prefer not to get bogged down into questions of narrow or broad or issues of comparability, etc. Journalists cannot abdicate the responsibility to data, and perfect data will probably never be available. But using whatever data is available and making sure that there is no regression to the previous normal, which is the data could vanish at any time, or it was a non-transparent process. We don't know how the sausage was cooked. As long as we are making positive progress onwards and upwards, we should continue to press. And the principle there that I would like everyone to get around is that if it is publicly funded, then that data should be in the public domain. And right now, a lot of that data is not in the public domain. So there are sort of new avenues and agendas to conquer, really, in terms of satellite data and in terms of rainfall and temperature data. All of that is commercially available. You can pay for it, but it's completely publicly taxpayer funded, but still not available.
Right, and one quick question before there are a lot of questions that have come in, so I'm going to jump to that. But a quick one to you, Ashwini, again. Now, between the narrow data streams that you seem to have, mastered relative to others, versus the broad data streams over which maybe there is some concern, do you feel the narrow data streams are, as you kind of proxify them and start extrapolating them well, are you able to get the same answers that we would otherwise want from, let's say, the big data streams?
Oh, not at all. And I that was not the intention at all. So if there is a Kannada journalist who is writing from Dharwad about North Karnataka, then the GDP data is useless to him because it's always at the national level and it's annual.
Right, but no, my question is, but he has, let's say, but you have access to fertilizer data, which obviously gives you some insights on agriculture, either growth, recovery, coping with unusual climate.
Yes, it does. I think it provides the same amount of traction as broad data streams, but it requires an agricultural journalist to interpret the data, which is not true for often the GDP data. The data contests that happen on Twitter are not between journalists who know what the GDP data is.
Okay. Rukmini, I think there are a couple of questions which maybe you and Mihir can answer. The first is, where does one learn data journalism if they're looking at a long future stuck at home?
There's a few good online resources like from the internationals and the ICJF, and the Reuters Institute. I don't know. I learned on the job, so I'm not.
So get in touch with Rukmini for sure, and there are some online sources. The Global Investigative Journalism Network, gign.org, has a lot of dedicated resources for data journalism. That's another place you may want to go to. Mihir, the Indian government has faced criticism over its handling of official data. How credible has Indian government data been over the years? Is the current criticism valid, or is it a media exaggeration?
One of the interesting things here is that, look, there was always an instinct in this country to, a bureaucratic instinct to say, if you're going to use my data, all right, I should be able, it's my data, not the public's, and I should be able to tell you what it says. All right. And this is like the basic thing. Like, it's the trying to explain to the average bureaucrat the difference between the data he had under his control and a quote from him was very difficult. All right. He's like, but I've given you both the data and a quote. You can't misquote me. How come my data is saying the opposite of the quote? He's like, that's really not how it works. All right. So there has always been this, and I don't want to exaggerate. However, I think the issue at the moment is that there were certain institutional structures on how high-level national data was prepared in India that had Many of our institutions have atrophied over time. We all know this. But those institutions around the collection and dissemination of statistics had remained fairly careful and fairly trustworthy internationally and globally among the people who follow this kind of thing. That trust has diminished considerably for various reasons in the past 6 or 7 years, partly because some of the statisticians who are within these institutions have themselves spoken out about concerns about it. That trust is diminished because some of the data has not been released on time. Nobody has said, Govind, I think, who takes this seriously, that somebody sat and tried to change a formula to benefit a government narrative. All right, I don't think anyone is saying that, or anyone serious is saying that. But what is definitely the case is that people no longer think that high-level Indian data is subject to the problems of collection in a large and poor country of the quality that it should be. That simple thing is not there. People don't talk about it anymore.
And that's a good point. I mean, as we head to a close, I mean, that people should believe your data as well, whatever your processes might be behind, and even if you've changed them, then conveying the trust about data is equally important. Anisha, let me throw this one to you. Outside of the economic sphere, which other sectors are ripe for data journalism?
Well, the entire socio-economic space for sure. Political data is certainly very rapidly expanding as well. A lot of the political stories that we see are now supported by socio-economic data. As you said, data on any kind of program implementation. So that could be in any space, typically relating back to economics in some way, but any kind of program implementation will have associated data with it. And satellite data overlaid over all of these, which can again provide additional insights in terms of interpreting the socioeconomic indicators.
Right, and that sounds interesting. So we are going to head to a close very momentarily, but let me get a last word from all of you. And Rukmini, let me go with you first. One is that is there a sort of broad takeaway that you have from this? Number one. Number two, can data and data-led journalism help fight misinformation?
Broad takeaway is that we need to be more creative about sources of journalism, sources of data, as a few start drying up, while still pushing for the overall principle of it. Misinformation, I wish this was the case. I haven't yet, I don't feel convinced of it. I feel like the same problems that apply to other journalism apply to data journalism as well, because it is shared within a bubble, and it's our challenge to break through that bubble.
Right, and I know we didn't touch much upon that, but there is still a marketing challenge for which journalists are also responsible or have to bear the cross. Ashwini, your takeaway, and can generally available of narrow data streams, better broad data streams, all of this help fight misinformation?
I can't think of any other way. So misinformation has two sources. One is selection bias. So I like to read the news that confirms my biases, and there is very little that one can do about it. It's getting worse on that count. But the other side of it is no corroborating evidence, and that I think we can continue to push forward on. And I think there is no other way but to use data to counter misinformation. And it has to be done in a targeted manner, but without the kind of efforts that Anisha outlined, or I have been involved in, and IndiaSpend has pioneered. Without the efforts to make data publicly not only available but also usable, we are not going to be able to fight misinformation.
Okay, Anisha?
Yeah, I think my broad takeaway is that we need to move to equilibrium where just a much larger share of the wider public and journalists and policymakers and so on demand to see data when they are evaluating some kind of claim, right? So they want to see what the background data is. They want to see what a comparison of two variables looks like. They want to know where the data has come from. That's the equilibrium that we really need to move to. I don't think we're there yet. So will we be able to stop misinformation with what we do? I'm not so sure, because I don't even know what percentage of the WhatsApp reading public is reading a 1,000-word piece about some esoteric data collection at all. All they're looking at is some graph that they've been sent on WhatsApp. So that's very challenging, I think. But I think, as Ashwini says, what other way is there to go? To move towards this equilibrium, we need to support initiatives to collect data and share it more widely.
Right. Thanks for that. Mihir, last word. Mihir, last word.
Yeah. Very simply, I think, first of all, I believe that the virus is going to be, if nothing else, is going to create a lot of interest in a lot of the narrow data streams we were talking about. I get an email every 2 or 3, twice or thrice a week from somebody saying, new 17 new unseen big data streams demonstrating, recovery in the northeast of the US or Latin America, or something like that. So it's like a lot of these attempts are being made in the absence of the ability to collect, in some cases, traditional large-scale data to try and see what else you can use. So that's one interesting takeaway. And the second thing is to move to the better equilibrium that Anisha is talking about. I think that, we just have to make sure that a larger proportion of the country understands what data is and how to interpret it. Frankly, we should, in schools, be teaching arithmetic, algebra, geometry, statistics. In fact, drop geometry. Arithmetic, algebra, statistics. That should be how people are introduced to math. I don't understand why statistics is, given that we live in a world where understanding numbers is going to be more important, perhaps, than reading some of the stuff that you do read in school. Introduce it in class 4, in class 5. At least that's mine. Sorry, it's a hobby horse. I'll get off it, but that's what I believe.
Right. Thank you so much, Mihir. Thank you, everyone. I think, there's some very, very useful points. I'm not going to sum up everything, but I think the trusting data is very important. I can see that there is a lot of demand pressure. Including all of you folks who are working on this, whether in academia or in media, and that's always good news, and hopefully augurs well for the future of data journalism. On that note, thank you very much, and let me hand it back to Sanjoy.